Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about the independent samples t-test. I'm going to be using the torture dataset in this video. This is the dataset that we used in class, but basically just a short reminder if you need a refresher. Basically what happened was participants were sorted into one of two groups, randomly assigned into a group where the questions were worded with using the word torture when describing torture, and the other condition, it was described as enhanced interrogation when they were talking about torture. So one group they were asked attitudes about the use of torture, and the other group was asked attitudes about the use of enhanced interrogation. So basically the idea is that if we word it as enhanced interrogation, it doesn't sound as serious or as negative as wording it as torture, and people have better attitudes about using it than they would if it was worded as torture. So for the independent samples t-test, we're going to be doing this because we're comparing the means of two sets of scores. So comparing two different conditions, so comparing the enhanced interrogation and the torture conditions. So it was a between subjects design, people were only in one of those two conditions, and that's why we'll do an independent samples t-test, because there are two conditions of our independent variable. So to do an independent samples t-test, your independent variable must be nominal, so it must be categorical, so like we have, and there must only be two categories. If we had more than two categories, we would do an ANOVA, which I'll talk about in a later video. And the DV must be at least interval, so it could be interval, ratio, or scale, but something where we have like an actual score to use. So in this case, there are 5 attitude questions right here, and I think that we're using like an average score of the 5 as our dependent variable. Yep, attitudes, and it's an average of those 5 questions. And another requirement is just that it's between subjects, which I already kind of touched on a little bit, but each participant is only assigned to or only belongs to one condition or one group. So let's get into it. So for this one, the hypothesis that we're going to examine is that participants in the enhanced interrogation condition will have more positive attitudes towards torture than participants in the torture condition. So like I was talking about before, that they'll be have more positive attitudes about it when it's called enhanced interrogation, because it doesn't sound as negative or as serious. All right, so to do our independent samples t-test and test that hypothesis, we are going to go to our analyses tab, and then we are going to go to the t-tests tab, and then we're going to click on independent samples t-test, which basically just means the samples are independent of one another, so this is a between subjects. So that's a good way to remember it, is that the samples are independent of each other. Each group was different. Okay, so once we click on that, what we're going to move over is we're going to put the condition, which is our independent variable, in this grouping variable category. So it's just basically saying like what are the different groups. So that's where we put our independent variable that is categorical, and then our dependent variable, we will put our composite score of attitudes, so the average score on all of the attitude questions, in our dependent variables box. So obviously dependent variable goes in the dependent variables box. That's a little easier to understand. I'm just going to check off these. So let me see if it says anything else to check off. Effect size and descriptives. Okay. All right, so this is all I'm going to check off for now, just keeping it simple for the purposes of class. I'm actually going to also check off that. I'm going to check off everything because I just prefer checking off everything. This is what I would typically check off when I was doing this. And now we'll just walk through it. So here we have our first table is our actual t-test table, and then the second table is just descriptives about like the means of each group. So I got that by clicking on that descriptives. If I uncheck that, that goes away. So our actual t-test is only this first part here. That is what our actual t-test is. So it's showing attitudes as the variable that we're looking at, since we're looking at attitudes towards torture, and we're looking at whether the attitudes are different by group. So then it's called the student's T, and that under statistic here, that's our T statistic. So the statistic associated with the test, which is just called our T statistic. So you can see that's a 2.70. Our degrees of freedom are 289, and we'll just report that when we're reporting the results. And if you need help with writing up the results, you can check the PowerPoint from week 13, which explains that. Week 12, sorry. And then we have our p-value, which is 0.007. So we can see from that there is a significant difference between the two groups. So our p-value is less than 0.05, which means we know there's a statistically significant difference. This is just showing us what our average difference is, our standard error difference, which you might need to, I don't think you need to report that part, but then our Cohen's d is our measure of effect size, which is a 0.317. I think we discussed this a little bit in class, but for a Cohen's d, looking at the effect size, anything below 0.2, we say there's like no effect. 0.2 to 0.5 is a small effect, so this would qualify as a small effect. 0.5 through 0.8 is a medium effect, and anything above a 0.8 is a large effect, and this can be a number greater than 1, but anything above that 0.8 is considered a large effect. And then we have our confidence intervals, our lower and upper confidence intervals, which when we say lower and upper confidence intervals, we're basically just talking about if we were to do this 100 times, at least 95% of the times, our scores would be within this range. Okay, so then the next thing we'll look at is the descriptives table. So this is just showing each group. So our enhanced interrogation group, we had 139 participants. The average was a 2.94, and this was the average attitude score. So they had a higher score than our torture group, which had a 2.46. So we're seeing greater attitudes towards the use of torture in the enhanced interrogation group. And this is just, looking at this table is how we figure out like which group was higher if there is a statistically significant difference, which there was. And then lastly, we can look at the plots, and we see here that this enhanced interrogation group has a higher attitude score than this torture group, which is right here. And those are just our confidence intervals there that it's showing. So basically, typically the rule is that you don't want the confidence intervals for each condition to be overlapping, because that would say that they're kind of the same score. So we're seeing that there's very little overlap between these two, which leads us to conclude that the groups are different, and that the enhanced interrogation group does have greater attitudes towards the use of torture. All right, that's it for this video. I'll see you next time.